Week we conclude our Presidential Library's History Uncovered series Friday night from the Bill Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. Tonight we'll stay on the Presidential Library's theme for the next 2 hours, featuring an interview with series producer Mark Farkas and C-SPAN researcher Eric Nelson. And we present new video and film clips collected from some of the libraries. Then an interview with Sharon Fawcett, head of the National Archives Presidential Library System. And an exclusive C-SPAN interview with President George H.W. Bush, done recently at his library in College Station, Texas.
Well, here we are, yeah.
We're going to show you around this a little bit. This right here, of course, that thing here will be your office. Okay, this will be your stateroom up front.
Good heavens.
Oops, I'm sorry.
Roomy setup.
Just want to peek.
Isn't this beautiful?
See the hot tub?
No hot tub, but we do have a shower.
You're looking at White House television footage of then-President George Herbert Walker Bush as he toured the new Air Force One, a 747, on September the 6th, 1990. You'll see the complete tour later on in our program. And during this time, we're going to see some of the film clips and video clips of presidents and first ladies that have not been seen in our previous 11 installments of Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered. The footage you're seeing was collected specifically for use in our series by Eric Nelson. And on your screen in just a moment will be Eric Nelson, whose job was what during our 12-part series?
My job was to go out and basically go in and search each of the 12 presidential libraries' AV collections, which is their film in whatever state that was, video, 35 millimeter, Super 8, and also the audio collection.
When did you start the project, and how long did it take you to go to all 12 of those libraries?
We spent about a week to 10 days at each library. I think the whole project took about 8 months of actually researching out in the field, and then, of course, having to come back here and compile, to go through everything and see what we got.
And we've done 11 of these so far. We got 1 to go, Bill Clinton.
Got 1 to go.
From your experience, what was the hardest part of this?
The hardest part, knowing what was in the collections, and that's not just from a researcher standpoint, but also from the individual archivist as well. Many times I would find material that they had never seen and they were not aware was in the collection. So we left with a wealth of material, a treasure trove of material, but at the same time knowing that there's so much more out there, that there's literally thousands of feet of film that nobody has seen many times since it was originally deposited at the library, 40, 50, 60 years.
Your boss sitting across the table from you there, Mark Farkas, the executive producer of this series. What was your goal for Eric?
Well, it was really, since none of these libraries had done a top-to-bottom review of what they had, it was really to send him out there and dig around to see what we could find. We've done series before at presidential libraries, and we'd interacted with them over the years, but we always had this thought that there must be more in these archives that people had not looked at. So it was really for us, along with Eric and Richard Norton Smith, to take a look at the listings in their collections and identify some things that we knew we wanted to try to get, but then really send him out there and interact with these folks and get them involved as well to try to find, you know, as Eric has said, treasures or other things that either had not been aired ever before on television, or in some cases, like with Herbert Hoover, had not been seen since the time they had aired in movie houses in the 1930s.
What are we going to see during this next 60-some minutes?
We're going to see a number of tape pieces that we have not shown in the previous 11 programs. Things with First Ladies Eleanor Roosevelt, Betty Ford, Lady Bird Johnson, as well as other pieces of material with presidents that we've not seen in the programs. Each one of the shows have had themes that we've pursued, and so some of these haven't neatly fit into themes, and other ones that were actually, you know, as Eric said, we have so much material. Some of this material we've just looked at in the last week or so and said, hey, this would be great to show the folks. So it's really pieces that have not aired yet.
Eric, where did you go to school? Where'd you grow up?
Grew up in West Michigan.
Western Michigan?
Grand Rapids, yep.
Where'd you go to college?
Davenport University in Grand Rapids.
And how did you get into this? Because I know I wanted you in a moment to introduce this first B-roll of Mrs. Ford. You worked at that library. How'd you get into it?
Got involved in politics and got involved in history really through first the Gerald R. Ford Foundation and then the Gerald R. Ford Museum. So
What was your draw to it in the first place?
President Ford was such a decent public servant, and he always called West Michigan home, although he hadn't lived there since even before becoming president. He traveled back there quite frequently, and actually the first time I met him was at a Bush rally in 1992 when Bush 41 was in town with Bruce Willis, President Ford. They were in for a rally. I volunteered. I was 17 or 18 years old. Volunteered for, and that started kind of a wild ride on the Presidential Library Express. I've been associated with them ever since, about 12 years.
And what other places have you worked in archives?
The Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum in Grand Rapids, the Robert J. Dole Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, which we opened 2 years ago, and then here with this project.
Tell us about this B-roll we're going to look at.
September 1974, Mrs. Ford goes in for what she thought would be a routine checkup at Bethesda Naval Hospital. The doctors find a nodule on her breast. The next morning, she's got a public appearance with the president at the LBJ Memorial Grove, groundbreaking, and she decides she's going to go ahead with that. And I think you'll see from this footage, only her and the president are aware of what's going to be happening in just a few hours. She's going to be shuttled to Bethesda for an emergency exploratory surgery the following morning. And if you look at her face now and the president's, you can see a bit of concern, but they're there for Mrs. Johnson, and really says something about, I think, Mrs. Ford, that she wanted to be there for her friend.
Mark Farkas, how much of what we found was silent and how much of it had voice?
You know, we haven't done an overall sort of measurement of that, but much of the White House television footage with LBJ and other presidents and President Ford has been silent, but there's a number of things, their public utterances and speeches they have audio on them. So it's a real mixed bag.
Eric Nelson, the next clip, and this does have sound on it, what is that?
The next clip, the following day, Mrs. Ford goes in for her exploratory surgery. It is malignant. The doctors remove it through an emergency radical mastectomy. President Ford had scheduled a series of economic summit conferences in D.C. over the previous several days, the final of which was going to be that day, which was a Saturday, I think September 28th. He flies through a rainstorm from the White House to Bethesda that morning to be with her when she gets out of surgery. He then flies back to the economic summit, comes in a few minutes late, and gives an update on Mrs. Ford's condition, and that's what we're going to see now.
Let's watch.
Bill,
Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, companions in this conference, and my fellow Americans, just one personal note, if I might. I just returned from the hospital where I saw Betty as she came from the operating room. Dr. Lou Cash has assured me that she came through the operation all right. It's been a difficult 36 hours. Our faith will sustain us, and Betty would expect me to be here.
You know, Eric Nelson, the amazing thing about this is you can see the emotion in the president back then, but it's 33 years later, and Mrs. Ford is very much alive.
Very much alive. As a matter of fact, when President Ford passed away, his office in Rancho Mirage, they were going to close it. And I heard a few weeks ago that they're keeping that open now, and it's now, instead of the office of Gerald R. Ford, it's the office of Betty Ford. So she's very much alive and in good spirits and good health, I believe.
Our next clip is a whole different era, a different party, and another First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. And tell us about what was the FDR library like when you went there and searching for video back in those days?
The FDR library is wonderful. It's a wonderful location. It's a wonderful staff. Unlike some of the later libraries, the FDR has a 100%, I think, or nearly 100% lock on their collection. They've seen it all. They've indexed it all. They've cross-cataloged it all. They know where everything is. And they have an institutional knowledge where if you're looking for something in particular, they can pull it right off the shelf. If you're looking for something in general, they can say these are the 12 sets to look through.
So how
that's
did you
different than some of the newer libraries that have not had a chance to go through their collection and therefore can't be as helpful in finding things because literally they've not seen it all themselves.
The library is at Hyde Park, up near Poughkeepsie, just north of New York City, an hour and a half or so. But did you literally look through all this yourself? Did you sit down and watch the entire excuse me, video that you brought back?
I watched every piece that I brought back. I watched. Yeah.
How did you know what to look for? I mean, how did somebody help you?
In some cases, had help from folks here. Had help from Mark. Richard Norton Smith was very helpful. The library staff was very helpful. The internet was extremely helpful. So we went into each library with an idea of what we were looking for, but also with an open-ended, knowing that there was material there that would be wonderful, not knowing where to find it. In some cases, pulling stuff at random off the shelf, just looking at it, seeing what it is. And that's where we found quite a few of the neater pieces that you've already aired in the series.
Before we introduce this piece, he mentioned internet, which reminded me of the website. And what was your approach on the website for folks that have been watching the series? What's there for them now?
All the programs that we've done on air are on the website. In addition to that, the real goal with the website is to take everything that Eric brought back and that we've also collected since, because the process has kept unfolding with these presidential libraries, and eventually put that up on our website. So you'll go there, see all the tape programs, and at this point we probably have anywhere from 15 to 20, 25 pieces of all the raw film and video and sound that Eric brought back, with the goal of having over 1,000 pieces of this on the internet and available and downloadable for folks to look at.
If you've just joined us, Mark Farkas is the executive producer of our Presidential Library series, has been working on this for...
We began the process really almost a year, over a year ago, thinking about it even before that, but from Eric going out to the libraries and then putting all these programs together, just about a year.
And one thing we want the audience to know is that this was not meant to be about the president's entire presidency. It was not meant to be anything other than looking for treasures, things that people hadn't seen before, trying to demonstrate how you get to one of these libraries, and then that's what Eric Nelson did in learning how you go about it. What's your next clip? And this is about a little over 6 minutes long.
Well, this is an example. This is one of my favorite pieces from the FDR. Mrs. Roosevelt didn't necessarily like the official duties of playing hostess. She wanted to do a lot more than that, and World War II allowed her to do that. This next piece, she's in New Zealand. It's September 1943, and she's there on behalf of the Red Cross. She's addressing the Allied troops in New Zealand. And take a look. I think you'll like.
I'm very happy to have the opportunity to come to New Zealand and see our own boys and the people of New Zealand who've been so kind to our boys. I think that this club is a grand club, and I'm sure that the boys who come here have a very good time. I'm sure that their hostesses have a good time too. Now, I think perhaps it would amuse you if I told you a little story on myself that happened in England last November, because I came in and I thought that there probably were a good many boys, and there have been all through the islands as I saw them, who thought to themselves, my goodness, here's Mrs. Rosewood traveling again. As I stopped at some of the islands, one person who greeted me seemed unable to speak for a few minutes, and then he finally said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Rosewood, but you're the first white woman I've seen for Now I go back to the story on myself, which happened to me in Great Britain. I was given a code name when I went to Great Britain, because just as when I came here, for safety reasons, they thought people should know who was traveling. So I was known in the code as Rover, which was rather an amusing name for me. Dealt with the fact that I was supposed to be on the move. And one day, my own boy, who's with the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, was in Great Britain just before going to Africa. And so we tried to go down and visit his unit one afternoon. We had stopped at several places, and we knew we were only about 3 miles away. But over there, they're very well trained. There isn't a signpost anywhere that tells you where you should go to reach another place. The names are all taken off the station. No village has any identification. And the reason, of course, is that you're within about 15 minutes by air from the enemy. And they're always expecting to have dropped from the clouds spies or troops or someone that they don't want to tell anything to. So we started asking where this airfield was. And everybody we asked, we knew we were within 3 miles, everybody we asked said, airfield, airfield. No, we don't know of any airfield. Never heard of an airfield. All the time we were doing this, Great Britain is covered with a system of teletype, which keeps watch over cars and everything else and sends word back to headquarters. So we were searching. We finally did find a general's headquarters and got someone to show us where the airfield was. But in the meantime, a teletype operator who had a sense of humor wanted to send word that we weren't getting where we wanted to go. So this is the message he sent back. Rover has lost her pup. There's another story that occurs at home and delights my husband that has to do with you. You boys have been up in Guadalcanal, various other places. And I think I'll tell it to you because it may amuse you as much as it always amuses him. Perhaps it's a story that came from here, and you may know it. Runs this way, that just as the Marines were ordered to leave Guadalcanal, an officer found a private feeling very sad, looking very depressed, and he said, "What's the matter with you?" And he said, "Oh, I just can't go on. I haven't shot a Jap." And so the officer said, "Well, listen, I'll tell you what to do. You go up to that ridge over there and jump up all of a sudden and say, 'To hell with your Hito.' And they'll jump up other people all around, and if you shoot first, you'll get a Jap." So he came by a little while later, and the Marine was still looking very gloomy, and he said, "Did you do what I told you to do?" And he said, "Yes, sir, yes. I ran up there, and I did just what you told me to do, and I said, 'To hell with Hirohito,' and they jumped up just as you told me they would, but they all shouted, 'To hell!'" knows. He knows what a wonderful job you've done. And he wanted me to come down here and see as many of you as possible, because he wanted you to know that he watched every day what every ship and every unit did. And he was very proud of the record all of you are making.
On your screen is the website for Presidential Library Series. You can find it at cspan.org. Look for Presidential Libraries down on the left-hand side. Eric Nelson, when she got that big laugh there, what did she actually say? Shot at the what?
For that, shot at the hill. And I couldn't understand the last piece either, but apparently it was apparently went over well.
When you went to a library, did they try to steer you onto certain things, or were you able to independently pick whatever you wanted to?
They didn't, and you know, the library staff, I think that's a big misconception in a way, that they are going to try to protect their particular president. That was a misconception that people had when I worked at the Ford Library. But you know, there's good and there's bad and there's ugly at all these libraries. You know, there's any administration is going to have a certain amount of things they're proud of. Going to have things that they made mistakes in, of course. And without exception, the archivists that I worked with would be as helpful pointing to the negative as to the positive, and they didn't try to steer. If they knew what I was looking for, they would certainly help me find that particular material. Or in some cases, if I thought I was looking for this, they'd say, no, that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for, and that's where they're really valuable. It's the institutional memory that some of these staff have that have been there 15, 20 years.
If you've just joined us, Eric Nelson was our researcher for this series on presidential libraries. He went to all 12 presidential libraries in the country, and he is originally from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Has been doing this here for how many months now?
Better part of a year, just over a year.
And Mark Farkas is at our table. He's the executive producer of our series. What was the most difficult part of this, and what did you miss that you would have liked to have gotten?
Well, I just wanted to tag on something that Eric said. The archivists absolutely have been incredibly helpful, the curators, and I do think that they come from a balanced viewpoint. One of the challenges, frankly, for our programs is when you get to the library director position, and these folks, especially with the living presidents, they're crossing over into two worlds. One is the world where they're working with the living president, and these museums really sort of are a legacy to the presidents. So you've got that competing with history, and sometimes it's been a little bit difficult to go right down the middle on each one of these presidents from a guest viewpoint. Although they've all been great, it's not, like I said, they've got their foot in both worlds, and it's sort of an interesting thing that our tax dollars are paying for these folks to have their feet in both these worlds, and it's not just straight history that they're doing, it's history and it's raising money for these presidential libraries, so it's a bit of a challenge.
Coming up in just a few minutes at the end of this particular segment, you'll see Sharon Fawcett at some point if you're watching this the day after Thanksgiving, and she is in charge of the presidential libraries from a national standpoint at the National Archives and Records Administration here in Washington, which is run by Alan Weinstein. Next clip, Eric Nelson, what are we going to see?
Next clip, 1937 or 38, I believe, Lyndon Johnson gives his wife a home movie camera, just like my grandmother had. And Mrs. Johnson went to the library and got a book on how to make home movies. And so you'll see in each of her movies, and you've seen several on the series so far, she starts with an establishing shot and then moves in just like a professional. This particular piece is listed as Mrs. Johnson's home movie #1, and it was shot in the spring and fall 1940 around Washington, D.C., Mount Vernon, whatnot. And it's really a narrated tour of our nation's capital by Lady Bird Johnson.
And it's about 6.5 minutes. Let's watch.
The Capitol, spring 1940. Lyndon had been in Congress 3 years. President Roosevelt is on the move. This is the way it looks from the other side of the fence. But where he was going and what doing is lost in the mist of time. And here comes the big touring car called the Queen Mary. There are two of them, one full of Secret Service. The crowd awaits him, the motorcycles, the George Washington Monument. cherry blossom time. The Jefferson Memorial is just being built now. And here is little Ann Thomas, the daughter of Congressman and Mrs. Albert Thomas of Texas. Swan boat. There's something irresistible about cherry blossoms time. You just reach for your camera. Lyra and I, Mrs. Thomas, both took movies in those days. Lyndon had given me my camera for Christmas, I think, of 38 or 39. Magnolia Solangiana in Anne, they match in color. Oh, those handsome buildings, the Federal Reserve. And there's Ivo Sparkman, Mrs. John Sparkman of Alabama, in front of the Federal Reserve building by the fountain, which always looks so cool in the summertime. There's the Public Health building, the forsythia, first sign of spring. I used to wear up hairdo quite a lot then. And this lilac was my own backyard. And this is a scene, two scenes, up in the Arlington Cemetery. Ah, that most dramatic spot in all the town. Just as a picture taker, I'm proud of that one of the red azaleas. And here we are, the Pan American. And Mount Vernon. How well those founding fathers chose their home sites. I like the kitchen garden best of all. Here is the bell. There were always espaliered peach trees and fruit trees in the kitchen garden. And there goes the fence stretching across the beautiful rolling Virginia countryside, the front view that looked down to the Potomac and the ceaseless line of people, and the sightseer's boat. Mrs. Nan Wood Honeyman, who was a congressman from the far northwest, Portland, Oregon, I believe. And there's Mrs. Jim Kane with her first child, Stephanie. Dr. Jim Kane, hadn't even gone to the war in those days. And there's Kitty Mae, Ida Mae Kane's mother, Kitty Mae Wirtz, with Stephanie in front of the pink dogwood. I think that was down close to the shore. This was made at the Custis Lee Mansion in Arlington. That lovely wisteria arbor, it is no longer there. And the double cherries, so much richer and deeper pink than the single kind, but not perhaps as graceful. The pansies and the tulips and the white dogwood, and there's the British Embassy. And the Venezuelan Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue. And there's the Japanese Embassy. It was not too long afterward, when Pearl Harbor came, that this embassy had to be guarded against crowds that wanted to attack it. Here we are on our way to Texas, traveling by car, stopping to see everything of interest. The home of Andrew Jackson, the Hermitage. Cedars, but they like the cedars of Lebanon, were always the mark of a house site of old-timers in the South. Someone said they're a sign of hospitality. Look at the lovely boxwood. A side view, and there he is, buried by his beloved Rachel in the flower garden out by the side of the Hermitage. My trips to Texas were always dotted by long stops at anything interesting.
Eric Nelson, how many hours of this did you watch?
A lot. Hundreds of hours.
And how did Lady Bird do this?
Lady Bird actually compiled this film over the course of 20 years, 30 years, and the LBJ Library inherited that once LBJ left office, and they compiled these based on year and even season, and then usually in 20 to 30 minute films. And then they asked her to come in to the library and do a retrospective narration. So the voice you're hearing is Lady Bird's, 20 years after she made the original piece, whatnot. And she's pretty good with the names and the arbors. And she was an arborist, I think.
What did you learn about her? How she learned to operate a camera? Because that's pretty good.
Again, the story that I heard is LBJ gave her that camera in 1938, something for a Christmas present or as a gift. And she used it as, she was his opposition researcher, unofficial, in the 1940 campaign for Senate. And I think someone asked her at one point, Mrs. Johnson, how did you get to be such a good movie maker? She said, I went to the library and got a book. And she got a book on cinematography, and she read it, and you start with an establishing shot, and then you move in a certain planned, and you can see she's quite a good movie maker.
Eric Nelson has been our researcher for the video on all of this stuff through the series, and he spent over a week in every location of a presidential library. There are 12 of them around the country. Mrs. Johnson and Lyndon Johnson's library is in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas. And we have, in this program, another 35 minutes or so to go with video. And Mark Farkas is our overall executive producer. Who else worked on this with you? How many people did it take to do the whole series?
Well, there's more people than I can count in terms of the studio staff, the field crews that go out and produce the material and direct the material, the directors here. Eric and I Eric sort of were the sort of the beginning and the end of all this. He went out at the beginning and brought all this back in. My job as executive producer is to guide these programs, and when we finally hit the air on Friday night is to line produce them. But really, in between that, our core staff, we've got 3 producers and production associate. Rick Stoddard. As much as Eric has looked at all this, Rick has looked at all of it again. Everything you see on the air has gone through him. He puts the graphics on it. He's worked countless hours. Russell Logan, one of our producers for a number of these programs, Delia Rios and Connie Debley. Those are the folks that go out to the libraries after Eric has gone there and worked with the directors, the archivists to plan the programs, and then they really go through the material and in a process with me decide what's going to be aired in the program, and they go and edit it all together. When it hits the air, it looks great. It looks like it just should be. There's a reason for that, and that's that they've gone through all of it.
Mark Farkas has been with C-SPAN for 23 years. He's from around this area, a graduate of William & Mary in anthropology. Did I get it right for once?
You did get it right.
Next clip. And how?
Next clip, we're going to watch Harry Truman. I think this is one of all of our favorites from the series. He did a television program called The Decision Series. Allowed himself to be taped between 1961 and 63 or 64 with a television company. And what hit the air was 26 half-an-hour, highly produced installments called The Decision Series. But what didn't hit the air remained in the Truman Library for years and years, with basically on the cutting room floor. Many outtakes, hours and hours and hours of Harry Truman either reading from a script that the producer wanted him to read from, or talking off the cuff about things. So what we're going to see next is Harry Truman talking about the founding of Israel that obviously happened during his presidency. And if you listen closely, he gets in a little dig at Eisenhower in this clip that we're going to watch. It's about 3 minutes or so.
I also antagonized a lot of people by recognizing the State of Israel as soon as it was formed. Well, I had been to Potsdam, and I had seen some of the places where the Jews had been slaughtered by the Nazis. 6 million Jews were killed outright, men, women, and children, by the Nazis. And it was my hope that they would have a homeland where they could operate. So when the time came for that, we set up the Israeli government in Palestine, moved some of the Arabs out, and they were not moved out and thrown out. They were compensated for the land that they had to give up. The Jews organized a government over there, and it's been a successful one ever since. They've done things over there that never have been done in that part of the world before. And while it's a small republic, it's an energetic one. Not long ago they had a fuss with Egypt, and if they hadn't been interfered with by the then President of the United States, Nasser would have been down in the Sudan where he belongs. That won't help diplomatic relations. But don't think that decision to recognize Israel is an easy one. I had to make a compromise with the Arabs and divide Palestine. The Jews wanted to chase all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates River, and the Arabs wanted to chase all the Jews into the Red Sea. And what I was trying to do was to find a homeland for the Jews and still be just with the Arabs. But when you go into a thing of that kind, the people you help most are the ones that get most angry with you. Both of them were against me on the situation, but as President of the United States, I paid no attention to them, carried out what I thought was right, and I had the support of the Congress, and I could do it, which is unusual in these days.
Could you tell us specifically that a lot of Jewish people were against you too?
Oh, well, there were a lot of Jewish people against me because they wanted the whole of Palestine. As I say, they wanted to drive all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
1539.
There they were on both sides. There I was in the middle, between both sides. I was in the position of the referee in a prize ring when the two big wrestlers turned on the referee instead of going ahead with the wrestling. I was in real trouble.
Okay.
746, take one.
The kettle was boiling, and the whole business was very discouraging. I wrote a letter to an assistant. I surely wish God Almighty would give the children in Israel an Isaiah, the Christians of St. Paul and the sons of Ishmael a peep at the golden roof.
Eric Nelson, you were commenting during when we were watching this, and that he never stopped moving back and forth in his chair the whole time.
He never stopped. So I guess that's the reverence that that the producers at the time had for the office of the president. That they wouldn't say, Mr. President, you're swiveling. Stop swiveling in your chair.
That was in his library in Independence, Missouri, which is right outside of Kansas City. When you went there, did you take this equipment we have on the table here?
Took this equipment, as a matter of fact, this is out of a C-SPAN jump kit that you see them going back and forth from here to the Capitol with, whatnot. Just a small handheld camera that also has a VCR feature. And with mini DV cassettes, we brought back all the material that you've seen in this series, some 1,200 pieces. Handy camera. And also with this laptop, recorded all the audio, took it from whatever format it was in originally, whether it was on tape, reel, whatever, digitized it, saved it electronically, brought it back.
So everything that you brought back, you put on either that camera in digitizing it or on the...
All the film, in whatever format it was in, would feed into this camera and was brought back on mini DV. Everything audio-wise was brought back on this laptop. Yep.
Mark Farkas, executive producer. What's next?
Well, the next thing we're going to watch is a U.S. Information Agency film that really documents Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace address to the United Nations. And I just want to, one of the things that this series has shown is that these are real time capsule pieces from how presidents communicate with the country to the industry of broadcast communications in general. We see President Truman swiveling back and forth, back and forth. These are sort of the early days of television and film. There's no way a president would go into a studio now and a producer would have a swivel chair there. It just wouldn't happen.
And it's, by the way, unlikely that we would be showing a USIA film. They wouldn't let us show that today.
Correct.
I mean, if they did it for today.
Yeah, and well, the thing we're going to see next, I don't even think there's lots of these that are made anymore. I mean, back then we're at the beginning of the Cold War. The government feels a need to get the message out to the people. And so what this is, it's a produced film. It is his Atoms for Peace address at the UN, but interlaced with lots of images of atomic bombs. And it's really his appeal for the world not to use nuclear energy just for the destruction of mankind.
And it's 10 minutes long.
Yeah.
At United Nations headquarters in New York, United States President Eisenhower arrives to make a proposal for the constructive use of atomic power. Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld greets the President. Inside the impressive hall, Madam Pandit, President of the General Assembly, welcomes Eisenhower.
Fellow delegates, it gives me great pleasure to present to you the President of the United States of America.
Madam President, members of the General Assembly, I know that the American people share my deep belief that if a danger exists in the world, it is a danger shared by all. And equally, that if hope exists in the mind of one nation, that hope should be shared by all. If there is to be advanced any proposal designed to ease, even by the smallest measure, the tensions of today's world, what more appropriate audience could there be than the members of the General Assembly of the United Nations? The atomic age has moved forward at such a pace that every citizen of the world should have some comprehension, at least in comparative terms, of the extent of this development, of the utmost significance to every one of us. Clearly, if the peoples of the world are to conduct an intelligent search for peace, they must be armed with the significant facts of today's existence. On July 16, 1945, the United States set off the world's first atomic explosion. Since that date, in 1945, the United States of America has conducted 42 test explosions. Atomic bombs today are more than 25 times as powerful as the weapons with which the atomic age dawned, while hydrogen weapons are in the ranges of millions of tons of TNT equivalent. Today, the United States stockpile of atomic weapons, which of course increases daily, exceeds by many times the total equivalent of the total of all bombs and all shells that came from every plane and every gun in every theater of war in all of the years of World War II. A single air group, whether afloat or land-based, can now deliver to any reachable target a destructive cargo exceeding in power all the bombs that fell on Britain in all of World War II. But let no one think that the expenditure of vast sums for weapons and systems of defense can guarantee absolute safety for the cities and citizens of any nation. The awful arithmetic of the atomic bomb does not permit of any such easy solution. Even against the most powerful defense, an aggressor in possession of the effective minimum number of atomic bombs for a surprise attack could probably place a sufficient number of his bombs on the chosen targets to cause hideous damage. Should such an atomic attack be launched against the United States, our reactions would be swift and resolute. But for me to say that the defense capabilities of the United States are such that they could inflict terrible losses upon an aggressor, for me to say that the retaliation capabilities of the United States are so great that such an aggressor's land would be laid waste, all this, while fact is not the true expression of the purpose and the hope of the United States. To pause there would be to confirm the hopeless finality of a belief that two atomic colossi are doomed malevolently to eye each other indefinitely across a trembling world. To stop there would be to accept helplessly the probability of civilization destroyed, the annihilation of the irreplaceable heritage of mankind, handed down to us generation from generation, and the condemnation of mankind to begin all over again the age-old struggle upward from savagery toward decency and right and justice. Surely no sane member of the human race could discover victory in such desolation. Could anyone wish his name to be coupled by history with such human degradation and destruction? So my country's purpose is to help us move out of the dark chamber of horrors into the light, to find a way by which the minds of men, the hopes of men, the souls of men everywhere can move forward toward peace and happiness and well-being. To hasten the day when fear of the atom will begin to disappear from the minds of people and the governments of the East and West, there are certain steps that can be taken now. I therefore make the following proposals. The governments principally involved, to the extent permitted by elementary prudence, to begin now and continue to make joint contributions from their stockpiles of normal uranium and fissionable materials to an international atomic energy agency. We would expect that such an agency would be set up under the aegis of the United Nations. The United States would be more than willing. It would be proud to take up with others principally involved the development of plans whereby such peaceful use of atomic energy would be expedited. Of those principally involved, the Soviet Union must, of course, be one. I would be prepared to submit to the Congress of the United States, and with every expectation of approval, any such plan that would, first, encourage worldwide investigation into the most effective peacetime uses of fissionable material, and with the certainty that they had all the material needed for the conduct of all experiments that were appropriate. Second, begin to diminish the potential destructive power of the world's atomic stockpiles. Third, allow all peoples of all nations to see that in this enlightened age, the great powers of the earth, both of the East and of the West, are interested in human aspirations first, rather than in building up the armaments of war. Fourth, open up a new channel for peaceful discussion and initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversations if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace. Against the dark background of the atomic bomb, the United States does not wish merely to present strength, but also the desire and the hope for peace. The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma, to devote its entire heart and mind to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life. I again thank the delegates for the great honor they have done me in inviting me to appear before them and enlisting me so courteously. Thank you.
If you want to watch this again, you can find it on our Presidential Library's website by going to cspan.org. Don't forget to put the dash in there. And you can find the library's connection off on the left-hand side. Mark Farkas, executive producer for our library series. Is there a chance that people have not seen that? That's 54 years ago.
There's a great chance people wouldn't have seen that. I mean, it came out in 1953. We really don't have a great idea where it would have aired in 1953. It was produced by the government. It may have been seen by government agencies. They may have tried to air it, but I can almost rest assured it's not been seen on television since then, if it was even seen then.
That's a United States Information Agency film done back in about 10 minutes. Eric Nelson, you did the research on this at these different libraries. What if the average citizen, not working for a news and public affairs organization, walks in the door? Can they watch this stuff?
They can watch this stuff. In most cases, there is a viewing copy available. And again, in most cases, that viewing copy has time codes. So for example, if you were to go to, don't hold me to it on this particular piece, but in general, if you were to want to see this piece at the Eisenhower Library, they would bring you a viewing copy, which in most cases is not that good a quality. It's been seen 1,000 times. Time code on the bottom. You watch it, and if that's something that you want to purchase from them, you can order that. And in most cases, if they can't do it in-house, they have a third-party vendor that they will send their original out to. A copy will be made, and you receive it a few weeks later.
We have another clip, this time from the Ford Library and Museum, where you worked for how many years?
In one way or another, for probably 4 years.
So what are we going to see?
It's November 1st, 1976, election eve. And this is President Ford's last-ditch plea to please vote Republican. Joe Garagiola is his treasurer, I believe.
I'm not sure what role he played, but I mean, the interesting thing about this is this is an election eve campaign commercial, basically done from Air Force One,
right,
which is an interesting.
And neither one of you
background.
old enough to remember Joe Garagiola was on the Today Show, or you remember?
Well, he was a baseball player. He's on the Today Show.
So he was the treasurer. I believe he was the treasurer for the campaign. He comes on in a plea and an introduction of well, you'll see.
and after this, we have one more clip of George Bush touring the brand new 747 back in the early 90s, and then we'll move on to an interview with George Herbert Walker Bush, and also an interview with Sharon Fawcett, who runs the presidential libraries from the Washington office here at the National Archives and Records Administration. This clip is about 7 minutes long.
Hi, I'm Joe Garagiola. In the last 10 days, I've been traveling all over America with an extraordinary human being, President Gerald Ford. And I've done it because I believe in this man. You know, I've never done much more before than just vote. But this year, the stakes were just too high to just sit on the sidelines. So on this last night before the election, I want you to see a film about Jerry Ford. A documentary about his background, about his family, about the job he's already doing, and about his hopes for America. And then I want you to hear from President Ford himself. But before you see this film or hear from the president, somebody else has something to say about this election and about this man. Now, all America knows her, and all America loves her. It's Pearlie, Miss Pearl Bailey.
I've never done this before in my life. I'm not here to judge men The Bible says I am not to judge. But I do hope that you think before you vote. Use all the goodness within you. Don't, just because some people will say, well, yeah, but what happened a couple of years ago? Yes, you're right. A couple of years ago, our country was truly shaken. And a man who was put at the head of it, named Gerald Ford. I really believe in his heart, oh, he's made some mistakes, honey. You better believe he has. I wouldn't sit here and even try to say he didn't. But I'll tell you what, if a man is trying, and a man has more than dreams, he has something called get up and go and truth. And most of all, he has something I like very much in every human being, simplicity and honesty. Because I really believe he's an honest man. That's why I like Gerald Ford. And that's why I hope that, I don't know, please think about it. It's so important. It really is.
That's a real lady. She gives you a lump in your throat. Tomorrow is a very crucial election. But tonight America is strong, America is free, America is on the move. But 2 years ago, America was in deep trouble. When I became president, inflation was over 12%. We were on the brink of a serious recession, the worst in 40 years. There had been a loss of trust in the White House itself. We were still involved in Vietnam. When I took the oath of office in August of 1974, I said, I have not been elected by your ballots, but I ask that you confirm me by your prayers. Those prayers really help. In the meantime, America has turned around. I put the ship of state on an even keel. I held a firm hand on the tiller for a steady course. And today, we're doing much, much better. The rate of inflation has been cut by more than 50%. The job picture is getting better. We've added 4 million more jobs in the last 18 months. 88 million people are working today. We've restored confidence and trust in the White House itself. And America is at peace. Not a single young American is fighting or dying on any foreign soil tonight, and I will keep it that way for the next 4 years. We have two major problems. One, to keep America strong, to meet the challenge of any adversary, to strengthen our alliances. And I pledge to you that the United States will remain number one. Our Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines will be the best as they are today. Some people have wanted to cut the defense budgets. That would be a big gamble. I believe that the way to keep the peace is to keep strong. But in order to keep our domestic economy strong, we need additional tax reduction. Last January, I told the Congress they should cut your personal taxes. I think the best tax reform is tax reduction. I recommended that your personal exemption be increased from $750 to $1,000. Congress didn't do its job. But on January 3rd, when Congress comes back, I'll have a tax reduction proposal on their desk so that they can give the middle-income taxpayer who has been shortchanged the kind of a tax reduction that group in our society so badly need. But in addition, we have some other problems. We'll do a better job in the next 4 years in making certain that the victims of crime are protected and that the criminal goes to jail. We'll do do a better job to help our older people who have earned our respect and our support. We'll do a better job in meeting some of the problems of our major metropolitan areas. We have a lot of things to do, but we're in shape to do it now that we're over the hump of the tough last 2 years. And so we come to the final round in this election. I want your prayers as you gave them to me 2 years ago. But I would hope that you would confirm me this time by your ballots. I promise you, I pledge you, that I will not let you down. Thank you, and good night.
I'm feeling good about America. It's something great to see. I'm feeling good about America. I'm feeling good about me. I'm feeling good about America. And I feel it everywhere I go. I'm feeling good about America. And I feel you ought to know that I'm feeling good about America. It's something great to see. I'm feeling good about America. I'm feeling good about me.
Eric Nelson, do you have any idea whether he was using a teleprompter?
I think he was probably using cards that were probably too thinly written black marker, and he was having a hard time not only reading, but as they transitioned to the next card, he looked like he was really struggling. Not to mention being on a moving aircraft.
We only have one more clip left in this particular program. Can you tell us, after looking back on your year research project, going to all 12 of these presidential libraries, what's the toughest part of your, what was the toughest part of your job? Keeping it clear in my mind that even though we had a list of what we wanted to look for at each of these libraries, that list was not all-inclusive, and it was just really a starting point. And making sure that when I got there and met with the individual staffs, that they were also aware that, unlike a typical researcher that says, these are the 5 things I'm looking for, I would come in with a list saying, these are the 5 things I'm looking for, plus anything else that you can think of that would be new, unusual, unique. And usually I would get blank stares back that first day. And then the following day, they would start trickling in to wherever I was, and they'd say, I think you'd really like this piece. And another archivist would come in, I think you'd really like this particular piece of film. And that's where we got a lot of the stuff. The archivists themselves would have given us some of their favorite pieces. Eric Nelson did our research for us in these libraries around the country during the last year for the executive producer, Mark Farkas. What's our last clip?
Well, the last clip is something that would have been great to play during our most recent program on George H.W. Bush, but didn't make it in because we were pursuing other things during that show. It is a tour that he did on the brand new Air Force One, shot by White House Television, so there were not other broadcast cameras on there.
The new 747.
Yep, the new 747. The old one made its way to the Reagan Library that we saw on the Reagan show, and he's walking through this on September 6th, 1990.
Well, here we are, yeah.
We're going to show you around just a little bit. This right here, of course, that back here will be your office. Okay, this will be your stateroom up front.
Good heavens.
Oops, I'm sorry.
Roomy setup.
Just want to peek.
Isn't this beautiful?
See the hot tub?
No hot tub, but we do have a shower, and that's here in your bathroom, sir.
Where's the bathroom? Right here? Hey, this is some beautiful place.
I have to go down here and make a left turn and go upstairs. So if you need anything, just tap on the ceiling and we'll get it done for you.
You need a manual to get this thing started, or do you know how to do that?
We got it.
Good, Danny.
You can stand under a tank.
You got another galley in the back?
Yes, sir.
You flown around on this, John?
Yes, sir. Sure did.
Yes, sir.
Kind of driving forward like that to get it out.
Gigantic. It's like it bigger than the Oval Office. Thank you, sir. Historic ride, both of you guys. Good to see you. We're just checking this thing out.
Had the tour, it's quite a thing. It really is. I don't think John can handle these accommodations.
I got to check him out. How are you?
Good, John. How are you?
How you doing? Good.
Marvin, where's your hat? How are you? We're going to Kansas. Where's your hat?
I gotta get it out. I'm all packed up here.
Okay.
I'm ready.
All right.
Bridget, you figured all this out? That's not the question.
No, I'm not. I'm reading my manual right now.
How to get the plane off the ground or how
Ask me to do something. I'm not going to be able to do it.
This Valdez? God, you poor guys have to put up with it. Do these lean back, way back?
So I haven't
Tell me
tried
how far back that goes.
back there.
I was thinking you saw this
That
stuff.
silver button right there.
Side.
There.
Hello, hello. Good to see you twice in one day.
Sir?
Well, politics is represented. Good. Great. Good to see you. How you doing? Look at all this. It is really roomy and nice. And this, huh? Pat, where are your guys?
Well, we've got some on this side and some on this side, sir. We're splitting it.
A little more comfortable. Very nice. Very nice. Go check it through. I'm just trying to think of the long game. Can I? Two different questions, but I'm sure I think you ought to take a look. When do we get this thing up in the air? Plus, they're going to charge you extra. I'll go up to see. I better not touch it. What happens on back here? Is this the two passages going back?
Yes, sir. On each side.
It's so much roomier. What's down there? Back?
Yes, sir.
Strictly baggage?
Yes, sir. And then we have the rear.
Hi, everybody.
The rear is the galley facility.
How are you? Nice to see you. Hi. How are you? You think you lost them? Laboratory. Initial flight for us, not for you guys.
How you doing, sir? Nice to see you.
Good to see you. This is the larger galley or the smaller?
Yes,
yeah.
Each equipment, sir, 50 on each galley.
Is that right? That's fantastic. Is this the end?
Yes, sir.
What happens back past there?
We got some storage area. Storage,
Yeah.
refrigerator.
Galley stuff?
Yes, sir.
Refrigerators, stand-up fridge.
Yeah.
Couple storage bins on both sides.
Well, this is really pretty. Not more room to move around. Yes, sir. Long flight like the one we're about to embark on tomorrow. How long a run is that? Did you take that out now?
About 9 hours, I think.
9 hours?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You're watching C-SPAN's Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, a unique look at 12 of America's modern presidents, using rarely seen film and video, revealing a new perspective of these men. Tonight's program will continue in a moment, and you can watch this program in its entirety later here on C-SPAN at 11 p.m. Eastern, and hear more about tonight's president with additional audio recordings and interviews with noted historians tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio, XM Satellite Radio Channel 132. And for more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries.
C-SPAN's Presidential Library series concludes next Friday, when we'll be live from the Bill Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. We'll have an exclusive interview with the former president, and we'll look at documents and artifacts not on public display. That's live next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. Next, an interview with Sharon Fawcett, director of the National Archives Presidential Library System. She talks about the Presidential Records Act and recent news stories about the Presidential Library System involving both the Reagan and Clinton presidential libraries.
Sharon Fawcett, director of the Presidential Library System. What's your job?
I'm director of the Presidential Library System. We have 12 presidential libraries around the country. My job in Washington, D.C. is to oversee the system. We work with foundations on the development of new libraries. That's a very important part of our job. We're also very involved in the transition from one administration to the next. It's a very exciting day on January 20th when people from my staff are in the White House clearing out those last few boxes, emptying the hard drives, pulling materials together, and getting them shipped to wherever the presidential site is.
How long have you had this job?
Well, I've been in the Office of Presidential Library since 1997. I was the deputy for a number of years. I've been director of the system for the last 3 years.
And what authority do you have under the law?
Well, under the law, we're responsible for all of their appropriated funds. We're responsible for management controls in those libraries. I determine in our office what resources will be allocated to each library. We oversee the administration of the contracts that manage each library, whether it's for security or for cleaning. And we're responsible for working with the foundations in development of the public-private partnerships.
How do the foundations work?
Well, the foundations are independent of the National Archives, of course. And it's interesting how the foundations have evolved over the years. When the first libraries were built in the early days of the system, a foundation would be formed to build the library, and it would basically then go dormant. It was really Johnson was the first foundation to want to have an active life, an active role in the library once the library was built. And it was President Johnson's vision, and he put the library on a college campus so that it could be very much a part of college life and could continue to influence, bring together the policymakers, journalists, academics, historians to talk about the issues of the day, how they're influenced by the past, and how to look forward to how to solve our problems. And that was very much Johnson's vision. It became a vision for many of the presidential libraries since then. And then in the 1990s, after years and years of budget cuts in the government, the National Archives no longer had funding available to support the public programs of the libraries. And we turned to the foundations to provide the support for public programs, for exhibitions, and for education programming. So much of that programming is supported with the help of our foundation partners.
How much money is spent by the taxpayer every year to maintain these 12 libraries?
The 12 libraries in last year, in fiscal year 2007, and we're just entering fiscal year 2008, and we haven't gotten our appropriation yet, so I can't tell you how much money we'll spend this year. But in fiscal year 2007, we spent a little over $58 million for the library system. And the foundations themselves contributed about $10 million directly to the libraries in support of the public programming, education, programming, and exhibits.
So that's the total amount from the foundation?
That's the total sort of direct amount. I mean, there's much more in-kind support that you can't really measure the dollar value of.
$58 million is split up evenly?
No, it's not split up evenly. It costs more to run some libraries than other. The most expensive library to manage, interestingly, is the Kennedy Library. It's not the largest of our libraries. I think it's maybe the third largest of the libraries. But it's located in Boston, and the cost of living is higher in Boston. Federal wages are tied to a locality pay index, so people in Boston make more money than people in Abilene, Kansas. So that makes a difference in how they run. Also, our contracts to support the building, because wages are higher in the Boston area, we pay more for our support contracts.
How many people are on the federal payroll that run these libraries?
About 400 people. On the federal payroll, actually, no, there's 400 total. About 280, 290 people on the federal payroll, with another 120 or so that are paid for out of the library's trust funds. And that's an interesting thing to understand. The libraries derive sources from three places. First are the appropriated funds from the government. That runs around $58 million last year. Secondly, from the foundations, who continue to support programs and in many cases provide staff to the libraries through internship programs, education directors, etc. And then the third source is the library's individual trust fund. Now that trust fund is operated by the government, and it comes from the revenues derived from admissions, and in the cases where the government runs the museum store, from museum store sales.
The Johnson Library is free. The only one of the 12, I believe, is free. So what do you do there? There's no income.
There's very little income. The Johnson Foundation is extraordinarily supportive of the library. They are one of the largest contributors in the system to support. They hire a number of archives aides for the library. They are helping us fund the presidential timeline, and so we manage without the admission income because the foundation picks up the slack.
What's the presidential timeline?
The presidential timeline is a web-based resource for looking at some digital assets from the libraries. There also is on it educational activities for children. We put it out sort of in a beta format last year. We worked with the University of Texas and their Technology Learning Center to develop this timeline, and all the libraries have contributed to it.
We'll go back to the, let's say for a minute, I am the director of the Lyndon Johnson Library. Do I answer to you?
Yes, you do. All the library directors answer directly to me and then to the Archives of the United States.
And why is it that I run a library, if I did, that is free to the public, and say the Ronald Reagan Library is like at least $12 to get in?
Well, the Ronald Reagan Library, the admission is split with the foundation because the foundation manages the Air Force One Pavilion, where that large artifact that you saw last week with Duke Blackwood, that really is something that's being managed by the Reagan Foundation. And so our ticket admission is split between them. President Johnson really wanted his library to be free to the public. I think in large part he wanted to have the highest attendance, so it helps to have free admission. And it's just been a precedent there. The foundation has supported that completely by stepping up to cover what the library would have paid for out of their trust fund.
So if I'm running the Johnson Library and then we have the foundation, how does that work and where is it physically located?
The foundation is actually physically located in the library itself. There's space allocated within the library for the foundation. Interestingly, before the Presidential Libraries Act amendments of 1986, foundations were allotted space within the library. Since that passage of that act that governed the size of libraries and actually restricted the size of libraries, the foundations have maintained their own space separate from the government space. And that is because they're trying to keep to a limited size in order to reduce the amount of endowment they pay to the government.
Who has the biggest foundation?
Oh, the biggest foundation. That's hard to say. The largest foundations are Johnson, Kennedy, and Reagan, are by far the best endowed foundations.
Do they all have foundations?
No, the Carter Library does not have a support foundation directly attached to it.
So how does the Carter Center work then?
The Carter Center carries on the programs that President Carter is interested in around the globe, and they occasionally do provide some support, and they're very interested in the library, but they're not directly responsible for raising funds for the library. President Carter, I think, though, is now engaged in the process of raising some money to endow the library and to build a new permanent exhibit.
An example of something that we know a lot of here because we've run a ton of them on our radio station, the Johnson tapes. So I'm the director of the Johnson Library. Did I determine whether those Oval Office conversations and other conversations of Lyndon Johnson's were made public?
Actually, the archive staff does the review process, but it was Mrs. Johnson who made the decision to override President Johnson's intent to have those tapes closed for 50 years. And after Watergate and the exposure of the fact that there were these tapes that existed, Harry Middleton, who was then director of the library, went to Mrs. Johnson to persuade her that this should happen. And interestingly, Tom Johnson, who you may know, who had once worked for Lyndon Johnson and later went on to head CNN for a while, was actually opposed to it, and now he says that was the worst decision he ever made, to oppose the tapes. He's very glad that they opened up. And now the library staff reviews them. When there were questions about what should be open, we would talk with a representative of President Johnson's family to determine if there was an issue. And remarkably, they were incredibly open, and generally what is closed in those are things that would violate the third-party privacy or embarrass another individual, not particularly the president, because, of course, as the C-SPAN listeners know who listen to those tapes on Saturday afternoon, there are a lot of things in them that might be embarrassing to Lyndon Johnson, but those things are open.
But fast forward to today, and you know the controversy over Mrs. Clinton and President Clinton's materials, and they have said no access. I don't know who said it, but I guess the president, Bill Clinton, said no access to that communication between my wife and I during the time we were in the White House.
That's not quite what he said, Brian. What he said in his letter easing the Presidential Record Act restrictions, and for the viewers, the Presidential Records Act has 6 categories of restrictions that a president can apply during the first 12 years he's out of office. Interestingly, he has to make that declaration while he is in office. If he forgets to send a letter to the archivist saying, I want to impose these restrictions, he cannot do so after he leaves office. So usually presidents, shortly after they're inaugurated, send that in, because if something should happen to them, the restrictions wouldn't be available to them. So in this case, what we've worked with every president since Ronald Reagan to find a way to ease those restrictions, because one particular restriction, what we call P5, the confidential advice restriction, would broadly cover just about anything anyone sent to the president. Almost everything could be construed as confidential advice unless it showed up in the press. So we've worked with presidents to try to pedal back on that restriction and say, what is it that you want to have restricted? And what President Clinton actually said in his letter is, I want to open a lot of my confidential advice, but there are a few categories of material that I want to look at before you open them. And one of them was communication between himself and Mrs. Clinton. He wasn't saying close it. He was just saying flag it for me. Flag it so my representative can take a look at it and make a decision about it. So that's the application of that restriction. And he only had a few categories in that letter. Another category happened to be correspondence or memos that he might have received from former presidents. So if he had a contact with the first President Bush or with President Ford, he didn't want to open that up unless he had reviewed it first.
Again, go back to the Records Act. The Presidential Records Act, the last time it was amended was when? Or was there only one time?
There's only one act. There have been 2 executive orders that implemented the act, or that provided directions to the executive agencies on how to implement it.
And the act was 86?
The act was 86, and then Ronald Reagan, just before he left office in January of 1989, issued an executive order about directing the federal government, especially the National Archives, on how to implement this act. And then it was revised by President Bush, the second President Bush, in 2002, I think it was. And that revision happened when we came to the end of the first 12-year period, when Ronald Reagan's library records reached the 12 years of age. There was a realization that that category of confidential advice could no longer be protected under the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act exemptions, because the Presidential Records Act covered all the FOIA exemptions except one, allowed after the end of the 12-year period to apply FOIA exemptions. And those are for things like national security, other statutory limitations like the Department of Energy or jury information, trade secrets that might come from commercial interests, personal privacy information. And there's a category called the deliberative process. The Presidential Records Act specifically eliminated the deliberative process for former presidents. That meant the only way to close anything would be through a declaration of executive privilege. And the whole issue of executive privilege never came up in the first 12 years after Ronald Reagan left office, because anything that was a concern could be closed under the P5 confidential advice restriction. And it's interesting because at the time the Presidential Records Act passed, there was a lot of concern that this category of information wouldn't be available after 12 years. And so the new executive order was written to extend the time that presidents have to review the confidential advice and to make their declarations of executive privilege.
Let me put the cynic's hat on here and ask you a bunch of questions that people talk about all the time when it comes to the libraries and the foundations and the federal government, and the fact that the archivist, your boss, Alan Weinstein, has a job that lasts how long?
There is no time limit on the job. A lot of people mistakenly think it's a 10-year appointment, but it's unlimited.
Can the president remove him?
The president could, but he's supposed to give a reason why he would remove him. He's supposed to inform Congress the reason why he's removing the archivist.
What I'm getting here is checks and balances. As the outsiders looking in, they say, okay, as we get close to this election, Bill Clinton doesn't want the records of his relationship with his wife and his wife's relationship to the pardon of her brother and all this kind of thing made public. What do you say? What protects the public from letting a politician get the government to pay to run these libraries, but then hold up the information for political reasons?
Well, the Presidential Records Act gives them the statutory interest in that, and without a change to the Presidential Records Act, that interest still prevails. And as a government official, it's our responsibility to make sure the rights of every individual are protected, whether it is the creator of the record or the user. The interesting thing about being an archivist has always been that we are sort of in between the user and the creator of the record. It's our responsibility to follow the statutes, follow the terms of any deed of gift that we're given, and also at the same time to advocate for access. And one of the ways that we advocate for access is to work with the President's representatives to ease those restrictions, to urge them to make material available as much as possible, and to follow the law. The Freedom of Information Act means that people request that record, and it's our responsibility to review it. And unless it can be closed under one of those exemptions or one of those restrictions, it has to be made available.
But then, again, cynics hat on, it takes years to get a Freedom of Information Act request approved by the courts.
I mean, litigated through the courts.
Yes.
It's interesting, you know, Presidential Records Act, when you're in the Presidential Record Act time period of 12 years, you have no litigation rights in the courts.
So it just,
the decision
that
is final.
information is held
The decision
up,
is final, and that's where we are in the case of the Clinton records. The decision that's made is the final decision. There's no appeal, there's no litigation.
What about George Herbert Walker Bush?
George Herbert Walker Bush records are now available, are no longer restricted by the PRA, so they are covered by the Freedom of Information Act, and if someone doesn't like a decision that's made, they can take it to court and litigate it.
And that takes
And one of the big issues in the revision to the executive order, Brian, is it took away the archivist's discretion on privilege claims. In the old executive order, it's so stated that if the former wanted to claim privilege and the incumbent president didn't want to uphold that privilege, the archivist could make a decision about whether to uphold the former's claim or not. Now, the fact of the matter is that this never came to that. We never tested what would happen because the new executive order was issued. Under the new executive order, President Bush said that unless there was some unusual circumstance, he would uphold the former's claim of privilege. He wouldn't question the privilege claim.
But the image that this President Bush has is one who issued the executive order in November 2001, and that he is withholding things from his father's library or even from the Ronald Reagan years for the public to be able to see.
Well, actually, you know, it's really interesting that since that executive order has been opened, we've opened, we've opened a couple of million pages. And of those 2 million pages, only 64 pages were closed under an executive privilege claim. Those were Reagan records, and that claim was asserted by the Reagan people and upheld by the White House. So
Would that have been
things are not being closed under that. It's a cumbersome process, but we do find that records are being opened. It's also slow because we don't have enough archivists to process records.
When was the last time you asked for more archivists and got them?
Oh, and got them. The only time we get more archivists is when we get a new presidential library, and then we get more archivists. We have, you know, we have a request in now for some additional archivists to process presidential records. We'll see, you know, where that goes with the president's budget, et cetera.
What do you think of having these libraries all over the country versus having them right here in the right under your nose here in Washington?
Actually, I think it's better to have them around the country. It makes them more accessible to more people, and as we move into the digital age, more of our records will be online, so it won't matter. You won't actually have to go to the library. One of the things I like to say about libraries is they're national institutions, but they succeed on the local level, and they're very much a part of their communities. They can drive the regeneration of a community, as the Clinton Library did in Little Rock. They are very much a part of the school life of a community, as the Eisenhower Library is in Abilene, and I find that very important. Also, I think you've had many historians that you've talked to who talk about being able to go to those libraries, which are in or near communities where the president grew up, and get that feeling of what his life was like. And that really informs their narrative and makes them more interesting.
So what's happened to attendance? And give us, I've got some figures here from 2006, which shows that the total attendance for all, at that time, 11 libraries, that's without the Richard Nixon Library because it wasn't under federal control at that time, was 1,769,822 for fiscal year 2006. Did you add the Nixon Library in 2007?
We added the Nixon Library in July, so our statistics we only have 2 or 3 months of statistics, and our statistics are by fiscal year, which is October to October rather than calendar year. So we have very few statistics for Nixon. I think in the 3 or 4 months that we ran the Nixon Library before the end of the fiscal year, we had about 15,000 visitors there.
Back in 2006, Ronald Reagan 440,000, Bill Clinton 302,000, Lyndon Johnson was third, 210,000, JFK 191, George Herbert Walker Bush 140, Harry Truman 135, FDR 108, Eisenhower 69, Jimmy Carter 62, and Gerald Ford was on the bottom at 58,000.
Well, Gerald Ford moved up this year. The death of a president has a real impact on visitorship at a library. Not only are people coming through the library while there's a viewing of the president in preparation for a state funeral, but there's a lot of visitation afterwards as people go to remember the president. And the same thing happened at the Lyndon Johnson Library when Mrs. Johnson died.
So what are the figures for 2007?
Well, for 2007, the highest attended library was Johnson at 330,000, followed by Reagan at 305,000, Clinton at 248,000, Ford at 245,000, and Kennedy at 209,000. The lowest attended libraries were Hoover and Carter.
And how many, on my list here, I don't think I had the Hoover Library figures. How many go to the Hoover Library?
Well, last year, almost 52,000 people in West Branch, Iowa.
Now, what do you think of those attendance records? I mean, you think of all the things that in this country that people go to, the sporting events and all that. It doesn't appear that a lot of people are using these libraries.
Well, 1.8 million seems like a rather good number to me, and it's not just people visiting the library, it's also our web statistics, the number of people that visit us online, and that's, more like 33, 34 million people who have long sessions with us. It's not just a hit on the library. We count a user session by how long a person spends visiting our
34
sites.
million a year. And when did that start?
Well, the Presidential Library started web, about 10 years ago. Started creating their websites, and many of them are very active. We have a lot of digitized material online. The Kennedy Library is involved now in a program to digitize their entire collection. They worked with their foundation and with a corporation, EMC, that provided funding in order for them to digitize everything.
Is there a limit to
and
how
that's
much,
the first library that will have done that.
The Kennedy Library? Is there any library that's not digitizing at all, or not running a website?
No, they all have a website.
So if you're running the foundation, is there a limit to how much money somebody can give the foundation?
I'm not aware of any limit. No, they're all 501c3s, and they're governed under those regulations. And if you want to go to guidestar.org. You can look up these foundations and see exactly how much money is donated to them.
And you can see everything about the
You
foundation.
can see how they can see how the money is being used. This, you know,
Do they have to tell us who the donors are?
they don't have to tell us who the donors are.
But if you walk in this,
But if you walk into a library, you often see the donor wall, which lists the donors who gave over whatever amount the foundation is specifying to make the donor wall.
what I've been to,
And I know there's legislation out there that would compel the disclosure of donations to libraries, especially while the president is in office and then for some period of time afterwards. And I think there were variations in various bills, whether it went until the library was built or it went until the president died. You know, there was some question of whether you needed to continue to disclose donations made to the Hoover Foundation, for example.
one of the things that I noticed, and I've been in all these libraries, is you look up on the wall, you see the country of Kuwait in the George Herbert Walker Bush Library. You see the country of Korea, South Korea, or you see Saudi Arabia. Is that a good idea?
Well, I don't want to speculate on whether that's a good idea or not. Those are usually countries that administration was very supportive of during the year. These are people who are no longer in office. I certainly think it's not a good idea to suggest that money would be given to a president while he's still in office. If the people who are running the foundation approach a country some year, you know, after the president has left office, I'm not as concerned about that. I would be concerned if those arrangements are made while the president's in office, and I think that's one of the things that the the proposed legislation is trying to address.
From the standpoint of the public, if you could change anything in this system right now, what would you change?
If I could change anything in the system, I would change how the endowment formula works for new presidential libraries. In other words, and this is just, you know, this is my thinking, this is not National Archives policy or anything like this, but this is what I would propose. When a library is turned over to the government now, an endowment equal to 20% of the cost of the library is provided to the government to offset the cost of managing that library. That endowment formula will actually go up to 40% after the George W. Bush Library is built, because legislation passed in 2005, I think it was, to raise that formula. I would set aside a portion of that to support public programming and exhibitions in all the libraries, so that the libraries could have a degree of independence, and we could begin to support better the programs that are done by all the libraries together. I think, you know, we just recently had a Supreme Court conference at the FDR Library. C-SPAN was there and I think recorded the first day of the conference, and I think you'll be airing that soon. But those kind of conferences where we bring together people from all sides of the debate or question and talk about the issues with conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, policymakers, legislators, academics, media people, are extraordinarily informative, but it costs a lot. It costs about $80,000 to put on a conference like that. So having a fund available that could provide that, because I really think that presidential libraries together as a system are greater than the sum of its parts, that we can begin to look at issues across the timeline of the presidency. The Cold War didn't happen in one administration. It began in one place, it ended in another place. There were many administrations that dealt with. The same with Vietnam, the Middle East conflict, how we deal with health care. All those issues cross lines, and I think by being able to study them across the presidential library system, we can remove some of the partisanship from the individual libraries that people criticize us for, and examine the issues and become a place where people can go to have a civil public discourse.
Now, we've just got a couple minutes. The library itself, let's say in George Walker Bush's case, the current president, 43, that library structure, wherever it's built, will be built with foundation money?
Foundation money. Or privately raised money. It could be not, you know, it's not federal tax money, but there are instances where local funds, local governmental funds or state funds have contributed to the building of a library. Maybe it's the donation of land on a university site or a park, such as the Clinton Library is in Presidential Park, and the city of Little Rock helped provide that land for that space. So sometimes there's federal or state money in it.
Under the
local or state.
Under the law, is the president allowed to raise money while he's in office?
Under the current law, yes, he is.
So he can go out and ask for as much, and somebody can give him as much as they want to give him for his library as he sits in the White House.
They could, although normally presidents step aside from that process and turn it over to their foundations or 501c3 organizations. The money would have to go to that organization, or it wouldn't be a tax deduction for whoever gave it.
But there is no restriction.
There is no restriction against that now. It is, it is an appearance issue, and it's up to the person who's president to make a decision about their role or their participation in any fundraising while they're still in office.
A couple quick questions. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Abilene, Kansas. I was born in the backyard of a presidential library. I would say the house I lived in, actually I think is the parking lot now. And I live right down the street from Mrs. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower's mother, and she died not long after I was born. But my parents talk about rolling me in the baby carriage down the street, and Mrs. Eisenhower would be sitting in her yard and come up and, check the baby on the chin.
Did you go to that library when you were a kid?
Well, interestingly, I think it's what inspired me to become an archivist. I went to the groundbreaking of the library. I was living in Abilene at the time. President Eisenhower came in October of 1960, just before he left office. It was his birthday. He broke ground for the library. Everyone in town, we got out of school, we got to go to the groundbreaking ceremony. And my dad had been in Korea. He came back from Korea. We moved away. My grandparents still lived there. About a year and a half later, we went back to visit. A woman who lived next door to my grandparents was the secretary to the director, and she took us over to the library. And it hadn't opened to the public yet, but the building was completed. President Eisenhower's papers had been at his farm in Gettysburg, and they were all in Army footlockers. And they were arrayed on the floor, row after row of Army footlocker. I am 13 years old, and I looked at those Army footlockers, and I said, wouldn't it be fascinating to open those footlockers and see what's in it? Well, fast forward about 8 years later, I finished graduate school. I went to the University of Texas in Austin, and Lyndon Johnson had decided to put his library on the university campus. I worked in the university archives, and I got connected up by the university archivists with the people who were running the library, and they hired me, and the rest is history.
How long did you work at the LBJ Library?
I was there about 7 years.
And then how long have you been in Washington?
Off and on. We moved to Washington in '77. Then I spent a few years in West Branch, Iowa, and came back to Washington, ran the
Hoover
research
Libraries
rooms.
in West Branch.
Yeah, right. Ran the research rooms for the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and then went into this job in 1997.
Sharon Fawcett, Director of Presidential Libraries, thank you very much.
And thank you for this series, Brian. It's been great working with you and your staff.
We've enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
For financial records and information on all 12 Presidential Library foundations, go to our Presidential Libraries website, cspan.org/presidential libraries. Next, a recent C-SPAN interview conducted for our series with President George H.W. Bush at his Presidential Library in College Station, Texas. It's 20 minutes.
Mr. President, what is it that you want this library to do?
I want it to accurately reflect the 41st presidency in the United States of America. And I think it does. And it takes, my mother always said, nobody likes a bragger. And so I apologize to my mother long in heaven for making, because it is all about me, but it's also about the presidency, how it works, how supportive the staff, the top staff was, how the system works. And I think it's just a kind of a vignette look at history through the time of the 41st president.
And what about the document side of it, the presidential documents? What do you hope that historians...
Well, I think that'll mainly be used by historians. They'll come, they'll examine in depth a lot of things on the domestic side, the Americans for Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, all these kinds of pieces of legislation. The history is there. What cabinet officer said to the president, how's that kind of stuff work? And then Foreign Affairs, it'll document the coming down of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, certainly Desert Storm, and so and hopefully this hemisphere, the capture and eventual trial of Manuel Noriega. So there's a lot of information here, a lot about China, where I served, and feel comfortable about China. I like China, and I think people can get an insight as to why I feel that way.
What's your philosophy on the timing of presidential records being released for historians?
I have no feeling on that. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, sooner the better. But there's some things that are confidential, and they're going to, as far as I'm concerned, they'll stay confidential. I mean, you don't want to get into the media like, who won, who said this, how come he didn't do what so-and-so said. I mean, for serious historians, it'd be great, but for trivial people that want to just tie something in, well, Cheney said this then, now he says this. I mean, I'm not interested in providing information for that. But we're governed by the laws here, and we just follow them.
What presidents have kept over the years has changed, and what they've done to keep different records has changed. What advice would you give to future presidents on what to keep?
Well, keep separate from something like this?
No, just keep in general. I mean,
I think you need to be sure you've got accurate diary material, whether it's a diary itself or not, of what actually went on, how you reached decisions. And I think we did pretty well on that. I mean, that's the important part of it, is that how the president looks at these problems, how he makes this decision as opposed to that one. And you can get it all here.
And they get it from you mostly through your writing.
Through?
Your writings.
Yeah, and that's right.
Tell me about...
maybe more than that, because you got a lot of paper that goes around National Security Committee meetings, goes around when you have a cabinet meetings, and there's all kind of routine reportage inside the White House that adds to the record.
I'm interested in asking you about your writing, though. You have kept diaries for years. Your letter writing.
I'd be sporadic in that, unfortunately, but I did. And right now, here we are at Texas A&M University. A scholar here is going to publish the diaries I kept on China, and that goes way back to the 70s, the mid-70s. And he takes it and edits it, and I said, oh, who the heck's going to be interested in what I thought way back in the 70s about my experience in China? And I'm now convinced that there will be some interest of China scholars and others, because China is so fascinating now. So I never thought when I was keeping that this will be a part of a president's record.
Did you keep diaries during your vice presidential and presidential years?
Sometimes. Not. I wished I'd done better on that. But yes, and some of those will be made public. And what I don't want to do is, be in the business of hurting feelings. If I might write down, I thought Joe Jones over here did a lousy job. I'm too old to be hurting people. I don't want to do that. And so to the degree that I have to say over whether that gets public or not, I don't want it to be public.
Take me back to your early writing days. Who instilled in you this idea of writing letters to your mother, writing letters to your grandchildren, the book that you put out? Where did that come from?
Well, I don't know. I think it was just always, when we were little, it was thank you letters. My mother, have you written your thank you letters? That kind of thing. But then I liked writing letters. This is long before email came along and spoiled all that. I don't do much of that anymore, because I have one of those BlackBerry machines, and I punch out and communicate, in brief, you might say. And I miss it in a way. Not that I was a great writer, but I miss putting my thoughts down in detail, and I'm spoiled now. And a lot of the American people are spoiled.
You think so?
Yes, I do. I think that a lot of them are opting out for some internet deal and not going to the detail that I once went to, and that many in my generation went to.
People coming to this library will be able to see for the first time what was probably your last letter that you wrote as President of the United States, and that was your letter to Bill Clinton. What was going through your mind as you were writing that letter to him?
Well, that I'd lost the election. I'd let a lot of people down. He had won fair and square, and I wanted to wish him well. So it's just kind of a human reaction, and I'm glad I did that. But probably, if you would have done the same thing today, if you just fast forward, I mean, if I just lost the election today, I probably would have done the same thing, not send him a BlackBerry, send him an email.
You said to him, don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. And when President Reagan left you a note, it was a little bit more terse. It just said, don't let the turkeys get you down. Criticism and how you react to it, how a president reacts to it.
Well, first place, you better be hard enough skinned to know you're going to get plenty of it. And some of it's fair and some of it is grossly unfair in your own opinion. So you have to learn to live with it and go on and do your job. And so you'll never get used to being torn apart in the media. And the national media, they like to get you down and then push you under. And it just goes that way. The pack journalism. And it's nasty. It's nasty today, and it was nasty back in 1992, and I expect Bill Clinton would have said the same thing. But this is the way it is, and you got to live with it. That's the price you pay in an open society.
I read someplace that you thought that the media had undergone a change, and that the change happened...
The gotcha media?
Yeah, that had happened in Vietnam and Watergate.
I think there was a change that came about because of Watergate. A lot of the media felt they were lied to. A lot of the young media, the journalistic schools, don't ever trust somebody in public office. I mean, there's this adversarial feeling that's always been there. It was honed to a much finer edge by the Vietnam experience. And so then you had to live with that. You had to do your best.
You were in the presidency in the early days of the 24-hour news cycle. What's the challenge of a president to be in that kind of news cycle?
Have good people around you so they don't wake you up all the time. You know, and we had great ones. Marlin Fitzwater was a great press secretary. We had Roman Pompadouk did the foreign press, now here at our library, running our library. And you just have to realize that this is the way it is. And you're not going to change it. So do your best. Do your best, try your hardest.
Tell me about the door behind you.
Well, this door was presented to me when I visited Kuwait after the war and after I got out of the presidency. And it's symbolic. I mean, a man, I forget what it says, man gives you the key to his house. It's one thing, we give you the door to the house, it means your family. And it's very symbolic and for me quite emotional still. And when the Emir presented me this door, it came with a great appreciation from the Kuwaiti people that I obviously should share with the troops and my own staff and all of that. But it means a great deal to me personally. And on the door are the names of every American that gave his life or her life in Kuwait, in the battle for Kuwait, freedom of Kuwait.
You got the door, I think in '93, and someone said it was about the same time of the assassination attempt on you?
Well, that same trip, they, unbeknownst to us, obviously, the Iraqis had come in to try to kill me in Kuwait. And I think they proved that they had their orders from way high up. I think Saddam Hussein. But anyway, this mission was aborted. Some of them, they had belts, you know, to come in and shake hands and explode. They found a couple of those belts in the desert. And it was serious stuff. But it didn't happen, so here I am talking to you.
At one place in this library is a target. And you're on that target, and it was all about Manuel Noriega.
Well, that target was a piece of cardboard, and with two names on it, Bush and Cisneros. Mark Cisneros was a major general then, maybe lieutenant general, who was in charge of our forces in Panama. And what people think is that Noriega, feeling embattled and surrounded, sat there with his own pistol shooting at the target. And pretty good shot. He might have been pretty close, I don't know, but there were a lot of bullets in my head. And there was a great hatred on his part. I think this was just about the time he saw he was going down, or that we were coming in. But anyway, it was captured in his headquarters, and Cisneros got it and gave it to me for the library here. Eventually for the library.
What do you think should happen to Manuel Noriega?
What happened to him?
What should happen to him?
I don't know. He's got several other places that want to put him on trial. In France is one, Panama is another. He served a lot of time here, but I'm not sensitive. I'm not very kind and forgiving about Manuel Noriega.
The Berlin Wall, you had talked with Patricia about it. Why didn't you go to Berlin immediately after the wall went down?
Because it would have been a stupid thing to do. A lot of the press got around my desk there and said, "How come, Mr. President, you can't express the emotion of the American people and do what Gephardt and Mitchell say, go dance on the wall?" Look, this is going very well with the Russians. And for me to stick my finger gloating, making an ass out of myself, dancing on the wall, sticking my finger in Gorbachev's eyes would have been a crazy thing to do. And he has subsequently said that it would have been terrible, and he was glad we showed certain restraint. We didn't know how the Russian legions were going to react. They had troops in the GDR, they had troops in Hungary, they had troops in Poland. We did not know whether the military would say, enough is enough, we'll show these gloating Americans, and, you know, maybe depose Gorbachev, in any event stand up and use force. The Cold War ended without a shot being fired, and some of that is because we showed restraint, and that wasn't even a close call for me. But in this emotional climate, I can just hear the voices. I'll spare you who they were saying this stuff to me through the media, part of the media, through the media. Why don't you go do this? I mean, you know, sometimes you got to do what you think is right, and it was right not to go put my finger in Mikhail Gorbachev's eyes.
People who come here will also see a big dome replica of the Capitol, and that's all about the 4 years that you spent in the House of Representatives. You've written that that time was a kind of a frustrating time for you.
Well, I don't remember writing that. That's my problem, is memory, but might well have been. I was a junior member on the Republican side in a Democratic-controlled Congress. I can think of other more exciting situations than that. And so it was frustrating, but it was a wonderful time because I made a lot of friends that still last. We had a great large class elected when I was elected. Many of them dying off, unfortunately. But I enjoyed the House, but I didn't feel I was really doing anything. I was good about constituent service. I looked after our constituents, but it wasn't charging forward. It wasn't like making decisions every day.
Who were some of those people that you met in Congress that you would maybe put on your great Americans list?
Oh, well, there's tons of them, but I mean, I just talked today to Congressman John Paul Hammerschmidt of Arkansas, who I love dearly as a friend, and I learned a lot from him. We had a lot of them. Bill Steiger was a young congressman from Wisconsin, much younger than I, and he did a wonderful job, and it excited a lot of young people to be involved in politics. And I hate to start down the list, but there's many. I got along with the leadership. I had great respect for Bob Michael, who was our leader, and Johnny Rhodes, subsequently deceased. And this is a good quality group, even though we were not calling all the shots. The Democrats were doing that. But it was, you know, I had good friendships across the aisle.
It's written on that that you learned 4 things in Congress. Never get personal, do your homework, persuade, don't intimidate, and be considerate. Now, what do you think? Do you think today's Congress works under those principles?
I think there should be more of that. I think there's a kind of a I don't know, an antagonistic feeling in Congress, kind of personal attacks, more than existed back in 1967, 68. We had some of that, but there was an ability to work across the aisle, and now it's kind of bitter and personal.
Is that to the detriment of the country?
I don't think it helps anything. It turns a lot of people off from politics. But again, I don't blame the Congress. You got plenty of things out there. I blame the media to some degree, because it's gotcha. It's always some headline. It's some point of controversy, and that climate does not encourage cooperation, civil behavior, and maybe that's easy for me to say at this stage in my life, because I'm not upwardly mobile. I'm not trying to go anywhere. I'm not trying to make any statements. I'm not trying to be on Meet the Press. I'm just glad I'm here talking to you. But maybe if I were still charging forward, I'd view it differently. But I think it cries out for civility.
Another thing that this library has is an interactive way in which it's the people who come here will be able to look at your domestic policy and actually listen to news reports and speeches you made and look at documents. And one of them that I noticed was the NAFTA, the whole NAFTA time during your time in the presidency. And I wanted to ask you, are you happy with how NAFTA has turned out?
NAFTA? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The attacks on NAFTA, I think, are mindless. It's been a huge success. Jobs created in Mexico, Canada, and the United States, and I think it's demonstrable success. Now, as you go into a campaign, you're going to have some of the labor guys are going to be complaining and getting their credit now in the primaries and in the presidential election, and you're going to hear some ex post facto criticism. There was criticism at the time, but on balance, I think it's a big success, and we ought to be very, very proud of NAFTA.
NAFTA then moves into the whole issue of immigration. Have you talked with folks about how you feel about the immigration issue?
No.
Do you plan to?
I'm strongly supportive of the president's position. Strongly.
Let me ask you about public service, which you talk a lot about these days. Given this climate that you talked about, will you recommend to your grandkids to go into public life?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because it's a noble calling. In spite of the bumps in the road, in spite of the ugliness of the climate, it's a noble calling, and we better get good people involved in it and not let them run. I get so sick and tired of spoiled kids saying, I can't change anything. My voice doesn't mean anything. I mean, come on. Sitting on the bench whining, get in the game. And that's what I think I hope some of our kids do. And I know they'll keep an interest in it.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about your wife's scrapbooks, which we are going to be featuring in our program on the Presidential Library Series. What do you think about these scrapbooks? I mean, there's 100 and some.
I think that my wife, Barbara, was a great scrapbook keeper, and she's a great person, a great leader in the battle for literacy, and she's a great mother and a great grandmother. And the fact that she's kept these scrapbooks over the years shows her love and devotion to family. And I'm very proud of all of that. And I'm glad that she's sharing those with people that come through this library. I might want to go through it myself and censor some of the family shots, but that's another question. If there's any of me there kidding around in a bikini, they're going out. I'm going to go find Patricia Birchfield here and tell her to get them out of there.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for coming, and good luck. Good luck on your series.
For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website, cspan.org/presidential libraries. The series concludes next Friday when we'll be live from the Bill Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas.